Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Dr. Oliver Cowan, a conservation scientist from the Conservation Science and Planning Unit at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and today I will be providing a presentation providing a brief background to the biodiversity tools available for land use planning and decision making. So let's jump straight into provide some context to my talk today, specifically why protecting nature should be at the forefront of our minds in land use planning and decision making. All things being equal, South Africa is the third most biodiverse country in the world. Most people will probably think of biodiversity as the plants and animals present in the landscape, and of course we are blessed with these in abundance. But biodiversity is also related to less tangible components, such as healthy functioning ecosystems, which provide ecological goods and services. Apart from the intrinsic value of conserving our biodiversity, biodiversity is of enormous economic importance to South Africa. Our tourism sector, of which biodiversity is a major drawcard, creates hundreds of thousands of jobs and brings wealth into our country from foreign fields. Furthermore, the rand value of ecological infrastructure and the goods and services provided by healthy functioning ecosystems is in the billions. Of course, South Africa is the developing country, and infrastructural development will continue apace in the coming years. We need to ensure that current and future developments do not come at the costs of our country's biodiversity through the promotion of ethical, sustainable, and properly thought out practice. A key arrow in our quiver to help us achieve this goal is biodiversity spatial planning. This allows for the strategic planning of the natural environment and allows for informed choices on which land uses are appropriate in which places. In the remainder of my talk today, I will introduce some of these categories and concepts, highlighting their importance in land use decision making before looking at some of the practical tools available to us. The first and most well-known of these categories are official protected areas. These include our world-renowned national parks, such as Kruger National Park and Kalahari, managed by SANParks, provincial nature reserves managed by provincial nature conservation bodies, such as Cape Nature in the Western Cape and Izimvelo KZN Wildlife in KwaZulu-Natal, and municipal reserves managed by, you guessed it, municipalities. These designated areas are all afforded protection from most developments by our legislation. Less well-defined, but still recognized as protected environments in the legislation, are mountain catchment areas, forest wilderness areas, and marine protected areas. These tend to be larger geographic areas of importance, and developments here are, or should be at least, carefully screened. Finally, we have other effective conservation measures, or OECMs, such as stewardship sites and conservation servitudes. These tend to be contractual agreements with private landowners, often including clauses which preclude developments on their land, which can be harmful to the environment. Critical biodiversity areas are defined as areas that are irreplaceable or the best option for meeting biodiversity targets. There are no other options for conserving the ecosystems, species, or ecological processes in these areas. While not protected in the legislation in the same way as official protected areas, it is desirable that CBAs are maintained in a natural or near-natural ecological condition. In terms of compatible land use, they are suited to open spaces or low-impact ecotourism, or things like recreation. Ecological support areas can be defined as areas that support the ecological functioning of protected areas or critical biodiversity areas, or indeed provide important ecological infrastructure. They should be maintained ideally in at least semi-natural ecological condition with no further intensification of land use. Land use suitability includes low-impact ecotourism or recreation, sustainably managed rangelands, certain forms of low-density housing, and even agriculture. CBA maps, which include data on protected areas, CBAs, and ESAs, such as the one presented on screen for the province of Gauteng, are developed using a scientific method known as systematic biodiversity planning. The amount of natural habitat that should be retained as CBAs or ESAs is determined through quantitative thresholds that are based on the characteristics of the species, ecosystems, and ecological processes in the landscape for which the CBA map is being developed. These quantitative thresholds are known as biodiversity targets, and they help to ensure that CBA maps have a basis in sound science. Sometimes, more than one biodiversity target can be met in the same place, so by identifying CBAs or ESAs that meet multiple targets, the method is spatially efficient. In other words, the CBA map shows the best arrangement of places to reach the biodiversity targets in the smallest possible area. Generally speaking, about 30% of the landscape should be kept natural, and another 30% at least semi-natural, in order to maintain long-term ecological health. The remaining 40% can be intensively modified by a range of land uses. Wherever possible, systematic biodiversity planning intentionally avoids identifying CBAs or ESAs in areas that are priorities for intensive land uses such as urban development or cultivation. This systematic biodiversity planning is mostly done at the provincial level. CBA maps are now available for all South African provinces and are updated approximately every 5 years to take into account changes in the landscape. The maps, like the one shown here for Gauteng, give details but include land use guidelines and give details about which land uses and activities are appropriate in each map category. The land use guidelines are usually shown in a table that lists all the possible land uses and then indicated whether it's yes, no, or restricted for each land use in each CBA map category. These maps are the biodiversity sector's input into decisions on appropriate land uses. There are two main ways that these maps should be used. Firstly, to inform spatial planning that shows the desired future land uses of the land, such as spatial development frameworks. And secondly, in decision-making in response to development applications, such as environmental authorizations. For the latter, the aim is to avoid inappropriate land uses that will compromise the desired state of critical biodiversity areas and ecological support areas. And if a proposed development falls within a CBA or ESA, this triggers environmental impact assessments in terms of the EIA regulations under the National Environmental Management Act. Developments that will modify an area from a natural state should not be authorized within CBAs. Examples include mining and urban development. Developments that will prevent natural ecological processes from occurring should not be authorized in CBAs or ESAs. An example would be linear infrastructure that disrupts ecological corridors. This slide provides another illustration of how these categories can be used to inform land use decision. Here, from left to right, are maps of the CBAs in the Western Cape, and a map of the mean wind speed in the Western Cape, and a map of the static photovoltaic yield available in the Western Cape. As the transition to renewable energy intensifies, identifying appropriate sites for development is essential. This slide comes with two important caveats. Firstly, depending on the renewable energy facility being built, it is not necessarily incompatible with CBAs or ESAs. And secondly, a number of other factors would of course be taken into account in site selection with environmental authorization. Nevertheless, it provides an example of how land use planning takes into account biodiversity to ensure sustainable and responsible development. On screen now is a list of some of the available tools where one can access some of the resources I've mentioned. The Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment hosts and maintains the South African Protected Areas Database and the Environmental Screening Tool. More on the latter shortly. SANBI, which is the South African National Biodiversity Institute, hosts a number of datasets, including most provinces' CBA maps. And other useful tools worth checking out include the Cape Farm Mapper, although this is Western Cape specific, the UN Biodiversity Lab, and our very own Endangered Wildlife Trust NoGo Map, which I'll also briefly touch on shortly. The environmental screening tool was a major development in the EIA process, and since 2019, I think around October 2019, it is by law required to be included in the scoping phase of an environmental impact assessment. It is and contains comprehensive and robust data, including all the CBA and ESA maps for all the provinces. The drawback is it is very limited in usage. It's EIA specific. Ideally, it's set out that environmental impact assessment practitioners upload their proposed study site, and it churns out a report stating the sensitivities of that site, including species-specific information and information on biodiversity land use specifications such as CBAs and ESAs. So it's not very user-friendly. One can't isolate CBAs or ESAs. It just comes out as a singular report. which is not very helpful for the general public, but can be very useful in the environmental impact assessment, and indeed is essential for this for the scoping phase of this. A second tool worth highlighting, I think, is Endangered Wildlife Trust's NoGo Map. I'm aware of time limitations, so I can't go into too much detail, but I would urge everyone to go check it out. It's incredibly user-friendly with an interactive interface, and in contrast to the environmental screening tool. But it does have its limitations in terms of what we have spoken about today. It's species specific, and apart from being able to map protected areas, it does not include a layer for CBAs or environmental ecological support areas, well, not yet. And it also is only relevant for highly at-risk species. Nevertheless, it is informed by robust species distribution data and isolates areas which we consider no-go areas for development, as they contain habitat for species that are incredibly at risk and almost irreplaceable in terms of the habitat listed. I realize this is a bit of a diversion, but on the left you can see some hotspot analysis showing where the majority or where the highest density of these no-go areas are. And this is incredibly useful for things like protected area expansion. So going forward, it will probably be an integral part of biodiversity land use planning. So looking forward into the near and medium-term future, I'm currently working on an exciting project creating a new land use decision support tool. Should be rolled out later in the year, and this will contain national scale distribution maps of all threatened and near threatened species. And we are looking into how to include some of the spatial layers in terms of ecosystems, like the CBAs and NBAs. And of course, there's a continued update and maintenance of the existing resources by DFFE and SANBI. But I do feel there is scope for opportunity for a new online tool which will incorporate both species and environmental or habitat data. At the moment, while most of the data is available, if you know where to look, it is a bit scattered and not necessarily the most easily accessible or user-friendly experience. So I think there is scope to take this forward in exciting ways. Well, that brings me to an end of today's presentation. I apologize, it was quite cursory in nature. A lot of theoretical stuff had to be packed into quite a small amount of time, and Eskom has not been kind with their level 4 load shedding. But hopefully it provided a brief background to some of the biodiversity spatial planning tools available. And if you have any further questions, feel free to contact me. My email address is on screen, and have a good day further.